Now you can see my pretty face.
If you want to ask questions, you have to use the mic that has a wire on it. In front of Luigi there is one, and there is one in front of Nora. So those of you who want to ask questions,
take advantage of the fact.
Yes, why don't you take advantage of the fact?
Yes, please do.
So, there will be several questions, but let me just ask one. You said that the FS plus group is better at lexical recognition somehow, and the FS minus is better at phrasal recognition, right? Now, what does it mean, really, lexical recognition? Because as you said, the lexicon has acquired a lot of importance, somehow it determines syntax, so we must really pay attention to certain subtle distinctions, or not so subtle distinctions within the lexicon. So take one distinction, which is the functional versus the contentive lexicon. So would that distinction show up somehow in your group? So did you try to see what happens in terms of lexical recognition in the FS plus group with the functional lexicon? Because the functional lexicon, in a sense, is much closer to syntax. And then
yes.
A close question would be, would there be any difference between nouns and verbs, for instance, within the alleged contentive lexicon? In fact, alleged because maybe nouns and verbs are more different than traditional assumptions would assume them to be. Okay, that's the question.
Yeah. Well, two answers. I mean, the fundamental answer is send money and we'll find out. We're, in fact, next Monday submitting a grant to NIH to explore just the questions that you've raised. But there is one experiment that bears on it that we did many years ago, a behavioral experiment. We took sentences and split them into two channels, taking all the function words. This is in English, where there's sort of clear delineation, most of them. Taking all the function words and presenting them to one ear, and the content words and presenting them to the other ear. And we were looking for the possibility that you do better if the function words are presented to the right ear, and the contents, that everybody would do better that way. We got that effect, but it was stronger for FS minus than FS plus. That's the other, but the major finding that we got out of that was that FS plus people understood the sentences better, faster, more accurately, when the stimuli bounced back and forth between the two ears, regardless of which ear got the function words and which ear got the content words. Whereas FS minus people performed better if the sentence was presented all to one ear or all to the other ear. And our interpretation of that finding at the time was related to the lexical access issue. That if the words bounce back and forth, you get an extra marker of the word boundaries, and that this would facilitate FS plus people if what their primary process for them is the analysis of individual words. So that doesn't exactly answer your question, but it does mean that we tried. That was like 20 years ago. But now, with the new to us neurological tools that we have, we have a set of experiments designed to try to titrate whether there's specific sensitivity in FS plus people and in which hemisphere and so on to associative information, to certain kinds of semantic information, to syntactic categorical information, just the kinds of questions that you're raising, for the reason that I think you raised it.
Hi, this is Tecumseh Fitch from the University of Vienna.
Hi.
Nice to meet you, so to speak. I have a question that starts from the evolutionary observation that we know motoric handedness is a weird thing. So humans are highly right-handed at the motoric level. Chimpanzees aren't. People are still arguing about whether there's a tiny tendency in chimpanzees. But it's clearly nothing like as strong as human beings. On the other hand, if we look at perceptual lateralization, so for eyes, for ears, we find very strong evidence that looks like it's very deep. So there seems to be a kind of evolutionary disjunction between motoric laterality and perceptual laterality. So this brings me to my question, which is that when we look in humans, and in particular in left-handed people, which I know you did not study left-handed people, but if you do study, those who study them have found in the early days with the WADA test, and more recently this has been replicated with MRI and what do you call it, Doppler, cortical Doppler. It looks like most left-handed people, even strongly left-handed people, nonetheless have left lateralized language. So, and as you know, those are crude measures, but at least that's what falls out of these traditional tests. So that suggests that whatever the underlying genetic basis is that you're getting at, you presume you're getting at with your pedigrees, it doesn't map exactly on to the underlying neurological laterality that we're interested in. So we're using righty-lefty motoric as a kind of proxy for what we really care about. And I'm wondering whether, these days it's not that big a deal to actually do, not a WADA test, but do this, what is it called, intracranial Doppler shift. That's a pretty cheap technology that you can do rather quickly. So have you thought about actually trying to get at the neural level, where maybe these correlations that are already impressive that you're finding would be even stronger?
Well, I'll just say what I said before, send money. No, I mean, I think that's a perfectly reasonable way to approach it. I have an intuition that I can't really defend yet, that the effects that are at issue here is having an expressed motoric laterality that is in conflict with your genetic background. So we're looking at right-handers who have some large tendency, in some cases, as far as we can tell from their family history, to have been left-handed. And I think that the left-handers, as a much stronger genetic or familial basis, overt basis evidence, overt evidence for familial left-handedness in most left-handers. And one of the things that has popped up occasionally in the literature is the question of whether the left-handers that seem to show some right hemisphere dominance are actually the non-familial ones. So I think that has to be looked at carefully. But anyway, I think that what you suggest is perfectly reasonable, and I hope that our research will either put us in a position to do such studies or stimulate somebody else to do it. One of the things that we are planning to do is to set up a website so that anybody can upload our pedigree, using our pedigree form, which is a writable PDF, can upload it and then automatically get whatever it is that our model predicts or claims is the central tendency for the likelihood of that person to have been left-handed. So I'm hoping that a lot of different kinds of results will eventually emerge that will converge on a better understanding of what's going on.
Thank you.
Jean-Pierre Changeux from Paris. Hi.
Oh, hi there.
My question is about the identical twins. Did you make some twin studies on that? Because there might be also a variability between monozygotic twins, which is known from the case. So, what are the data on the twins?
Well, again, we thought about that. We started a preliminary collaboration with Rooryck in Amsterdam, and Dirk Smits, who in fact have a lot of neurological data on about 2,000 twins. I mean, of course, they have other data on many more twins than that. This is the large Dutch study of twins, but which has, I can't remember, 30,000 or some twins or something like that. But they do have ERP and EEG data on a large subset of that, and we're planning to, we've already had discussions about collaborating to look into just the question that you raised. One of the points that I should mention, since this is an international audience here, the model that we have is based on American data, where left-handedness has been culturally accepted for maybe 50 years, at least. And so you do not have much of the concern that grandparents might have been reported as right-handed, but they really were left-handed. It is true that until recent times, if you went to a Catholic school in the United States, you might find your left hand severely wrapped with a ruler if you tried to write with it, but that's faded. Whereas in Europe, so for example, in Leipzig, which is the former East Germany and then the former Third Reich, there was, in those eras, very strong prejudice against left-handedness. And so what we're doing is gradually building up a model that is specific to that region as we get enough data from enough subjects. It is interesting that the model that's based on American subjects did such a good job, the genetic load model correlated in a fairly interesting way with the variables. I should have pointed out, well, you probably figured it out. I mean, the study with the Planck was done in Leipzig with German subjects, as you heard in the German examples. But I do think in the long run, more attention is going to have to be given first to validating the model. Validating the pedigree. At the moment, we're just living with whatever subjects tell us. But we do need to go back and check, spot check, with families to make sure that, or to get a calibration for the accuracy of the model. In the case of the German questionnaire, the German correspondent questionnaire, we add the possibility that somebody was gezwungen, that is to say, forced to be right-handed, and a good number of people actually report that in their parents or grandparents. So I just mentioned this because it's, I think it has to be attended to. But in general, to go back to your question, I totally agree that the twins should provide us with a lot of interesting data, and we started discussions with Dorit actually more than a year ago, and we're gradually converging on that.
Hi, Tom.
Hi, David.
I'm supposed to be double-fisted here?
Yes, somehow, but does it work?
It's not working. Is it working? It's working for me. I can hear myself.
Can you hear?
Okay. So I wonder.
Well, I know what you're going to say. I know what you're going to say anyway, so it doesn't matter if I hear.
Perfect. Then why don't you go ahead and ask yourself the question? And I'll answer it.
Yeah, you know what my answer is.
Okay, so I'm about to send money, and now that we get this. So
very good.
If we can unpack the main empirical result a little bit and see if we can derive some other experiments we might do. So the ERP experiment uses this early left anterior negativity response, right? It's very early, it's fast, it happens in experiments in which a sentence, an item makes a very strong prediction for a category that can occur, and you get it when it doesn't occur. So for instance, if you hear then you can hear, the caterpillar, that would be good, or the hungry caterpillar would be good, the very hungry caterpillar would be good, the in would be bad. That's the case where you get it, right? So that's in fact, one of the only cases where you get the in. So it seems to be in those cases where you have a very strong prediction of a certain type. And in fact, maybe that's true for the musical
equivalent that's kind of dodgy in my view anyway. But what's the interpretation of that really? Is it that Fs plus and Fs minus probands have a different access to the degree to which items predict other items, or the phonotactic probability, lexical? What's actually going on? Because if we could pin it down a little bit, we could maybe do slightly easier experiments that allow us to. I guess I just don't know what your interpretation is.
Well, I had one. Yeah, I had one slide on that. Our interpretation initially is that it's kind of related to what you were just describing. That if what, to put it functionally first, if what FS or behaviorally, if FS people are particularly sensitive to statistical or at any rate predictive relations between lexical items, then intruding or something that breaks a low-level prediction like that will be particularly noticeable to an FS plus person. And of course, a simpler way of showing that than doing an EEG study would have been just to do a behavioral study, to have them hit a button when there's a strange word or something, which we haven't done. But we could have done that 30 years ago if we had thought of it. So our initial interpretation, I think, is consistent with what you speculated, that that particular kind of anomaly. People call it ungrammaticality. I just don't think that's the right way to look at that particular kind of paradigm. I think it's more related to what you said, my understanding of what you said, which is that at one level of organization of sentences, we are making very dumb but powerful predictions of a serial sort that in the dark days of behaviorism, people argued was the only thing there was. But the fact that it's not the only thing, the only kind of process that there is, doesn't mean that it isn't very strong and important. And so, well, that's all I can say. I mean, I think that is at least a fruitful interpretation. What it leads to now in the way of better
it's not going to be the same interpretation for the music case, right? Because people don't have musically stored fragments at the same time. At the same time, they
I'm not sure. Right.
Calculate online what is a fair continuation in the musical case.
Yeah,
so
but isn't that the same?
It's not the same kind of animal, though. I mean, in the linguistic case, you have a rich predictive model and some kind of statistics that you know. But in the musical case, presumably you're deriving it from now a fifth is right and now it's not. Because you're the context online in a very particular way. It doesn't seem to me the same kind of animal.
I think you're right. I think that a better or a more analogous thing would be some note or chord that intrudes in the middle of a sequence, as opposed to just being an odd ending for the sequence. So I think that's a fair criticism. I don't know if it's a criticism. I think it's a fair observation. Well, are we communicating through brainwaves now, or what?
We're busy sending you money.
It's not like writing checks.
Well, some of you are in a much better position to do some of the important studies that we've alluded to and that we haven't mentioned. So I'm hoping I can encourage you to contact us about what we might collaborate on.
Why weren't the ELAN studies framed as an N400 study?
And did you in
That's
fact
how you
have
talk about
N400?
it. Were there N400 materials in this? Was it an N400 study and you looked at the ELAN?
I'm sure Angelo would have put those in.
No, it wasn't.
These are the classic Rizzi materials. There's probably a ELAN N400 P600 design achieve?
On the basis of the behavioral data.
Right. No, we haven't. We just completed the study. The data that I showed you was about 80%, 75% of the data that was collected so far. We've just finished collecting all the data, and in fact, back at the Planck, they are busy doing what the Plunkers do so well, which is analyzing just those components. But I don't know the answer to that yet. We just started with the ELAN as the first step. But Daniela Samler has told me that there are interesting downstream effects, but I just don't know what they are yet. Yeah? Somebody?
Hi, Gergely Csibra from Budapest. Very simple question. So I understand that you didn't study left-handed people, but right-handed people. So I mean, shouldn't you predict that? So if the idea is that this FS plus population has the same genetic background, it's just not expressed some way or other something, then you should find the same effect even more expressed in left-handed.
Well, as I said, my intuition from the occasional left-handers that have popped into our studies over many years is that familial left-handers may be just like familial right-handers, actually. And that it's the left-handers that might show a difference are those who are not familially left-handed, just as the people who are showing an interesting effect among right-handers is those who have some evidence that they would or could have been left-handed. So it's, in a sense, having handedness that crosses with your family background. If I want to, with more temerity, say that crosses with your genetic background. But of course, that's, we're using the family-based genomic model as a proxy for the genetic background. So we don't really know about the genetics yet. There's a group in Nijmegen, a new group with Simon Fisher and Clyde Franks that we're also collaborating with. Their specific interest is in the genetics of, among other things, left-handedness. I just got some contact with them. It's not going to be easy. It is surprising, given that it's been known for a long time that the heritability of left-handedness is roughly between 20 and 25%. That's based on twin studies. Oh, and the interesting thing about our model, by the way, is that with an entirely different method, it converges on exactly the same range of predicting heritability of left-handedness. But that's a very big number for a behavioral heritability, and yet the little that we know about about the genetics of familial left-handedness is primarily parasitic on studies of autism and schizophrenia, where there's, of course, lots of money to support them, where research is done. Clyde Frank's research is an example on one form or another of psychosis, and then as a side issue, the discovery pops up that there's some evidence of a particular DNA site being correlated with left-handedness, because many of those psychoses are themselves have a much higher incidence in left-handers. But it's surprising how little is known. Anyway, I guess I went off on a tangent with respect to your question. Why don't we study left-handers? Well, we should study left-handers. It may not be apparent, but the research that, one of the reasons that the research that I'm presenting is so collaborative is that I've been running it with rather meager laboratory funds available to me in my own laboratory. So there's a lot of stuff we'd like to do that we haven't done yet. But I agree that just as twin studies will be important in pinning down more about what we're doing here, so will the study of left-handers. But I'll mention one other thing about left-handers. The literature suggests that there are many ways of becoming left-handed. Some of them are genetic, but a number of them may be related to perinatal trauma of one sort or another. I mean, there are claims about that in the literature. And so left-handers themselves are probably going to be at least as heterogeneous a group as right-handers, and perhaps more so in terms of the etiology of the left-handedness. Oh, hi.
I want to ask you, is there anything about ambidextrous, people who can do things equally, with right and left?
Well, the way we classify subjects to try to have as clean a break as possible, I talked about left-handers in your family background. It's really non-right-handers that we're looking for. So if somebody reports a parent who is ambidextrous, we count that as the same as reporting a parent who is left-handed. But of course, ambidexters as a group may have their own particular properties worthy of study. Much harder to define. I mean, operationally. Some people say they kick with their left foot, but they throw with their right hand, and they sight with their left eye, and they, and so on and so on. And they, when their favorite direction for turning is to the left, and you have a complex of different laterality, motoric phenomena, and it's I think a very difficult problem. I mean, it's just operationally difficult to have a clean phenotype. But there's an aspect of all this which you haven't asked me about, which I'm going to say again. I'm going to answer, even though you didn't ask, which happens to coordinate just fortuitously, perhaps, with a paper that David just sent me. That I had a chance to very quickly skim. And that's the question of what we're looking for. The question is, what are we looking for when we look for the neurological foundations of language? Or what can we expect to find? And a very strong form, if I can, I'll just engage in fantasy about evolution of language. A very strong form of a claim that could be supported by our findings, or at least our claims about our findings, is that what evolved in humans that differentiates us from other animals is an enormous vocabulary. And there are mathematical arguments that have been proposed by a number of people that in a language-like system, if you only have a small number of lexical items, syntax isn't very important. But that when a large number of lexical items becomes available, then you need some traffic rules, and that then syntax becomes relevant. So one interpretation is, that I mentioned at the end of my talk, is that language, now to use a metaphor, language is like water. It seeks its own level in each individual brain. So that a brain that is genetically organized in a particular way will end up processing the particular subcomputations involved in language, to use David's kind of metaphor, in particular locations perhaps, or with particular pathways that can differ from another brain. And so looking to the brain organization to explain the particular kinds of processes that language has may just be wrong or a mistake. And that if the brain, if individual normal brains process language in ways best suited to that brain, to those brains, then we have an argument that it's not the organization of the brain itself that is causing the language structure to be the way it is. We have to look to something else.
I think, if I may answer to that, this is a very old argument which Fodor used to say that brain research was useless for language studies. So this is, I think, simply meaning that there is another simple relationship between the organization of the brain and the function, that there is an additional difficulty, but that doesn't mean that one should not try to understand what the universal are, despite the variability of the neurological organization. And this is really the challenge for the next decades. It's not something to abandon, but something to strengthen.
I think that's what I meant, but I didn't mean to imply that because it's complicated and variable we should abandon it. I meant that we should be aware of that and in fact let that enrich what we do. So I agree with what you said.
No, okay, it's not a new concept or a new vision. This has 30 years, at least. Even Ekan, with whom I discussed, was already thinking along these lines. You mentioned him, actually.
Yes, I knew him.
I want to know, is anyone, we've heard from Noam that language is like a snowflake, from you that it's like water. Does anyone have scheme? Because I'm ready for something bad.
Well, I mean, where do you think snowflakes come from?
Question.
Just, it sounds to me like your theory should also have predictions for acquisition. Like, do you expect different kinds of patterns for acquisition as a function of this FS plus minus?
Now, first, I want to say to the rest of you, this was not a plant. That is to say, I did not ask Susan to ask me this question. But here's an answer. We were interested, just as a speculation, in the difference in the so-called critical period for language acquisition in FS plus and FS minus people. And at that time, I was at the University of Rochester with my colleague Alyssa Newport, who established a very interesting way of probing for the critical period using deaf kids as the basis for that kind of research. And at Rochester, there's the National Technical Institute for the Deaf, which is the public equivalent of Gallaudet, and has a very large number of deaf undergraduates. And one of the things that they do at intake for freshmen is they give them an exam for their extent of their knowledge of American Sign Language. And we, with Danielle Ross, a graduate student at that time, we collected family handedness information from about 500 freshmen, and they reported how long they had been exposed to ASL and the age at which they had been exposed to ASL. Because it was still the case then, this was a good number of years ago, it was still the case then, much more rare now, fortunately, that there are deaf kids, as you know, who are exposed very early to ASL, and there are other deaf kids who may have some home sign but don't really get exposed to ASL until quite an advanced age. And what we found, using the college's metric of the knowledge of ASL, which was a pretty crude instrument, but nonetheless gave some information, we found that the critical age for mastery of ASL, the age at which you must have started it in order to have good mastery, was much younger for FS plus deaf people than for FS minus. And that's very striking. We published that a few years ago in Brain and Language. So the cutoff for good knowledge of ASL for FS plus was about age 8. If you started to learn ASL after age 8, the initial mastery of ASL as assessed by the college was much worse than if you started before age 8. But for FS minus, the fall off basically really didn't occur, but it started to in the data around age 11 or 12. But there were very few, relatively few subjects, undergraduates who started learning ASL after age 12, and so we didn't have very much data there. But clearly for FS minus, starting ASL anytime before age 12 resulted in roughly the same high level of mastery. But in the case of FS plus, it fell off much earlier. Our interpretation of that at the time, we attempted to find a bridge from that fact to the lexical hypothesis for FS plus. The interpretation, I think, is questionable, but I'll tell you anyway. Our interpretation was that if the way an FS plus kid enters language is through the lexicon, as opposed to through early mastery of compositional structures, and if there is an endogenous, i.e. separate basis for the remarkable, if there's an endogenous basis for the remarkable vocabulary learning capacity of kids between the ages of 5 and 10, reaching a peak at around age 8, I think, or so, where kids are learning some incredible number of, I think, 27 words a day or something like that, that the FS plus kids are dependent in some sense on that function. And so when the vocabulary learning function falls off, then it is harder for them to learn a language. We have some related evidence from second language acquisition. I did a study and am enlarging it now, looking at college kids in Spanish classes, learning Spanish. And all we do is get their familial handedness pedigree, and then the system here, at any rate, in the intermediate classes has a final exam which has what they call a grammatical component and a lexical component. And what we in fact are finding is that FS plus students do better on the lexical, relatively better on the lexical than the grammatical component, and conversely for FS minus, which is also, consistent with what we're looking at. And the final fact that relates to your question, Susan, is an unpublished study of where somebody was collecting MLUs of normal hearing children, mean length of utterance, which is the yardstick used for, and still is in many cases, used for the stage at which a kid is in language acquisition. And I had access to this person was a friend, and she collected family handedness information, and I looked at the actual data, the MLU data, and differentiated the FS plus and FS minus kids, Of course, I couldn't tell with the kids themselves whether they were right or left-handed, but we could look at the familial handedness. And what I found was that the MLU for a given age of FS Plus kids was longer, more words. But then I analyzed the sequences into those sequences that could be grammatical sentences of English from those sequences that were ungrammatical in some form, in some way. And actually the FS minus had a higher rate of producing grammatical sequences than the FS plus. So the FS plus guys produce more words, but it doesn't mean they produce more grammatical sentences. They're actually producing less grammatical sentences. So there's a story here that seems to have some general consistency, but that's as much as we've done with the acquisition.
So I think we are running late, and
Okay.
we cannot accept any more questions. We were extremely pleased to have you with us, and we thank you very much.
Well, I wish I could be there. Let me just close with one anecdote. Oliver Wendell Holmes never read a newspaper. Oliver Wendell Holmes was a very significant Chief Justice of the American Supreme Court. And he he claimed he never read a newspaper. And somebody asked him, well, how do you find things out? And he said, well, if it's important, somebody will tell me. That's why we have conferences, and it's why I regret that I can't be there, but I'm glad of this opportunity, so thank you.